This story did not begin with a statement from Washington, it didn't begin in Caracas, and it didn't begin in Beijing. It began with timing. Behind the public narratives, something far more precise was unfolding. Multiple actors operating under different rules were moving toward the same objective. Not territory, not influence, an asset. And whoever reached it first wouldn't need to announce anything at all. There was no visible countdown, no public acknowledgement that a race had even started. But inside diplomatic, financial, and intelligence circles, the clock was already running. What made this moment unusual was not urgency, but coordination. Decisions were being made in parallel. Legal frameworks were being tested. Financial pathways were being examined for weak points. Each side understood the same thing. Once control was established, reversing it would be difficult without escalation. That is how modern power operates. It does not rush. It positions. At the center of this race sat something far more tangible than ideology. A reserve with liquidity, leverage, and strategic weight. Something that could be frozen, redirected, or rendered unusable without ever leaving its vaults. And everyone involved knew it. For years, Venezuela's assets had existed in a kind of legal limbo. Claimed, disputed, sanctioned, yet still relevant. They were not inert. They were dormant, waiting for the right moment to be activated by whoever could establish authority first. That moment arrived quietly. Signals began to surface not in speeches, but in legal filings, in subtle shifts in enforcement, in the way institutions suddenly treated assets that had been considered untouchable for years. This was not improvisation, it was execution. From Washington's perspective, the calculation was simple. Delay creates risk, ambiguity invites competition. Once another power establishes a foothold, options narrow quickly. So the move had to be decisive but defensible, not dramatic, not noisy, just effective. What followed was not a seizure in the traditional sense. There were no images of vaults being opened or shipments being escorted away. Control in this case meant something more abstract and more powerful: jurisdiction, custody, authorization. By the time public discussion caught up, the critical decisions had already been made. The race was no longer ongoing. It had been resolved. China, meanwhile, was not absent from this picture. Its interest was real. Its channels were open, but timing, as always, mattered more than intent. And this is where the story turns. Because what looked from the outside like another chapter in a long-sanctioned saga was, in reality, a demonstration of how quickly assets can change hands without ever moving an inch. No announcements were required, no confrontation was necessary, the vaults didn't need to open, the outcome had already been secured. And once that happened, the balance shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently enough to matter. The question now was no longer whether control had changed. It was how few people had noticed it happening. To understand why this race existed at all, it's necessary to strip away the politics and look at the asset itself. This was never about symbolism, it was about utility. Silver occupies a strange position in the global economy. It rarely dominates headlines, yet it sits quietly at the intersection of finance, technology, and industrial production. That combination gives it a flexibility few assets possess. Unlike oil, it doesn't require constant movement to maintain value. Unlike currency reserves, it doesn't depend on trust in institutions. And unlike many commodities, it can function both as collateral and as input. That dual role is what makes it strategically attractive. For Venezuela, silver represented something increasingly scarce: optionality. In an environment defined by restrictions and constrained access, having an asset that can be pledged, frozen, leveraged, or redirected creates room to maneuver. Even when it cannot be sold openly, it still matters. These reserves were not just a line item on a balance sheet. They were part of a broader network of claims, guarantees, and negotiations that extended far beyond Caracas. Every major actor understood that whoever controlled the legal status of those assets would shape future outcomes. Control in this context didn't mean extraction. It meant authority. Authority to decide whether the asset could be used at all. That distinction is critical. Physical possession is slow and visible. Legal control is faster and far more difficult to challenge once established. And in a world where enforcement increasingly happens through institutions rather than borders, jurisdiction becomes the real battlefield. This is why the vaults mattered even if they never opened. As Venezuela's economic options narrowed, its remaining reserves took on disproportionate importance. They became leverage not because of their size alone, but because of what they represented. The last piece is not fully integrated into the sanctions framework. That made them targets, not in the sense of theft, but in the sense of resolution. Ambiguous assets invite competition. Once ambiguity is removed, the contest ends. From Washington's perspective, allowing that ambiguity to persist carried risk. Any delay increased the possibility that another power could establish influence through financial channels, custody arrangements, or alternative clearing mechanisms. And once that happens, reversing control becomes exponentially harder. Silver's role as a globally recognized store of value added another layer. It doesn't need transformation to be useful. It doesn't need conversion to be relevant. It exists outside many of the mechanisms designed to regulate modern finance. That independence is precisely why it draws attention during periods of geopolitical stress. The asset itself did not need to move. Its status needed to change. Once the legal framework surrounding the vaults shifted, the asset's function shifted with it. What had once been a flexible reserve became a constrained one, not because of confiscation, but because of definition. Defined assets behave differently. They lose ambiguity, they lose optionality, and in doing so, they lose strategic value for those who no longer control them. This is the part often missed in public discussion. Control does not require spectacle. It requires recognition by the institutions that matter, and once that recognition is granted, the outcome becomes self-reinforcing, which is why this race was never about speed alone. It was about timing the moment when legal clarity could be imposed with minimal resistance. That moment came before China could fully act, and when it did, the vaults became something else entirely, not a source of leverage, but a closed chapter. What happened next did not resemble the kind of action most people imagine when they hear the word seizure. There were no dramatic announcements, no visible transfers, no images designed for public consumption. Instead, Washington moved through channels that rarely attract attention outside legal and financial circles. This is where the gap between perception and reality becomes important. Power at this level is exercised less through force and more through frameworks, through recognition, through the ability to define which claims are valid and which are not. The United States did not need to physically access the vaults to control them. What it needed was something far more effective: institutional alignment. That alignment begins with jurisdiction. By establishing which authorities had the right to recognize ownership, custody, and enforcement, Washington was able to shift the status of the assets without triggering confrontation. Once that shift occurred, every institution operating within that framework was compelled to follow. Banks adjusted their treatment of the reserves. Custodians revised their obligations. Compliance departments recalculated exposure. Each adjustment reinforced the next. This is how control consolidates without spectacle. From the outside, nothing appeared to change. The vaults remained where they were. The metal did not move, yet its role within the global financial system had been altered. Timing was critical. Acting too early would have invited challenge. Acting too late would have allowed alternatives to form. The window in which action could be taken without escalation was narrow, but it existed, and Washington moved through it decisively. What made this possible was preparation. Legal groundwork had been laid years earlier. Precedents established during earlier enforcement actions created a pathway that could be activated quickly when conditions aligned. This wasn't improvisation. It was execution of a long-standing framework. The Trump administration understood that once another major power established parallel recognition mechanisms, the situation would become far more complex. Competing claims create stalemates. Stalemates freeze assets indefinitely, but they also limit leverage. Acting first avoided that outcome. By the time public debate began to catch up, the decisive steps had already been taken. What followed were explanations, not decisions. The outcome was already embedded in institutional behavior. This is why the move felt sudden to observers. The visible phase of the action came after the critical phase had ended. Headlines trail execution. In this case, they trailed it by weeks. What appeared to be an aggressive maneuver was, in practice, a calculated adjustment within existing rules, one that relied less on confrontation and more on recognition. Once recognition shifts, the system follows. And in a system where access is mediated by institutions rather than borders, that shift carries real weight. The vaults did not need to open. The control had already been established. What remained was reaction. China did not enter this story late. It was already there. What it misjudged was not the value of the asset, but the speed at which the situation could be resolved once legal clarity began to form elsewhere. From Beijing's perspective, Venezuela represented a long-term relationship, one built on financing, infrastructure, and strategic patience. Assets were not viewed in isolation, but as part of a broader portfolio of influence. That approach usually works. China is accustomed to operating in environments where ambiguity persists, where negotiations stretch over years, where leverage accumulates slowly and visibly. In most cases, time favors patience. This time, it didn't. Interest in Venezuela's remaining reserves was not speculative. It was practical. With global supply chains under pressure and financial pathways increasingly fragmented, access to tangible assets carried renewed importance, but access in this case depended on recognition, and recognition was slipping out of reach. China's channels relied on engagement, negotiation, and alternative arrangements that require time to mature. Those mechanisms are effective when space exists to operate. They are less effective when definitions harden quickly. The shift happened faster than expected. Once Washington moved to consolidate legal authority, the environment changed. What had been negotiable became defined. What had been flexible became constrained. That distinction mattered. China did not lose access because it failed to act. It lost access because the window closed before its approach could fully materialize. This is where timing becomes decisive. In geopolitics, strength is often measured in scale. In financial control, it is measured in speed. The ability to finalize recognition before alternatives solidify can outweigh years of accumulated influence. Beijing found itself facing a situation where engagement was no longer enough. The asset was not disputed openly, it was simply no longer available. There was no confrontation to respond to, no announcement to contest, no visible move to counter. That silence was itself the outcome. From the outside, it may have appeared that China hesitated. In reality, it was recalculating in a landscape that had shifted beneath it. Once control is embedded institutionally, reversing it requires escalation. And escalation carries costs that often outweigh the asset itself. China understood that. So did Washington. This was not a failure of intent or interest. It was a mismatch of tempo. A reminder that different systems move at different speeds, and that speed can determine outcome. By the time China adjusted its posture, the race was over, not because the vaults had been emptied, but because they no longer needed to be accessed to be decided. And in modern power dynamics, that distinction is everything. One of the most persistent misconceptions about power is the belief that control requires movement, that assets must be transported, that value must change location, that possession is always physical. In this case, none of that was necessary. The vaults remained closed, the metal stayed where it was, and yet everything changed. This is where modern financial power diverges sharply from older models. Control today is less about holding something and more about defining how it can be used. Who can recognize it, who can authorize it, and under what conditions it becomes relevant at all. The moment legal authority shifts, the function of an asset shifts with it. What once existed as leverage becomes dormant, not because it disappears, but because it can no longer act. This is why the physical location of the silver was almost irrelevant. Its strategic value depended on recognition within the global system. Once that recognition was settled, the outcome was fixed. Institutions responded immediately. Banks adjusted classifications. Compliance frameworks updated risk exposure. Custodians treated the reserves differently, not because they were ordered to, but because the rules had been clarified. That clarification carried weight. Assets don't need to move when the system around them changes. They simply lose the ability to interact, to circulate, to influence outcomes. This is what makes jurisdiction such a powerful tool. It operates invisibly but decisively. Once established, it becomes self-enforcing. No single actor needs to intervene again. The system does the work. This mechanism explains why public attention often lags behind reality. People look for visible signs of action, trucks, ships, announcements, but the decisive moment happens elsewhere, on paper, in recognition, in authority. Once that threshold is crossed, the debate ends. For Venezuela, this meant that an asset long viewed as a potential bargaining chip was effectively neutralized. It could still exist, it could still be counted, but it could no longer function as leverage in negotiations that mattered. For China, it meant that engagement had lost relevance. There was nothing left to access, not because the vaults were empty, but because they were closed in a different way. This is why speed mattered so much. Whoever finalized recognition first didn't need to escalate, didn't need to justify, didn't need to confront. The outcome became embedded in process, and process is difficult to reverse without cost. This moment reveals something deeper about how power is exercised today. The most decisive actions are often the least visible. They don't announce themselves, they simply redefine what is possible. Once that redefinition occurs, the rest follows automatically. The vaults didn't need to move, the rules did. What this episode exposed was not a new strategy, but a clearer version of an existing one. Power today is less about declaration and more about definition, less about confrontation and more about sequencing. The side that defines the framework first rarely needs to argue its position later. This is where many analyses fall short. They focus on outcomes without examining the mechanics that made those outcomes inevitable. They ask who won, without asking how the conditions for winning were established in advance. In this case, the decisive factor was not scale or pressure. It was coherence. Washington did not need to invent new tools. It relied on mechanisms already embedded in the global financial and legal architecture, mechanisms that function precisely because they are accepted as neutral until they are activated. Once activated, neutrality disappears. This is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature. A system designed to operate through rules will always favor the actor that defines which rules apply and when. China's approach, by contrast, emphasizes endurance, long horizons, gradual accumulation of influence. That strategy works best in environments where definitions remain fluid and access remains negotiable. Here, neither condition held. The framework hardened quickly. Recognition was settled, and once that happened, the space for alternative arrangements narrowed to the point of irrelevance. This does not suggest a permanent advantage for one side over the other. It highlights a situational advantage rooted in timing and alignment. The lesson is not about dominance, it is about tempo. Actors that move within existing structures can act faster than those building parallel ones. That speed advantage matters most in moments where ambiguity is about to collapse. Another insight emerges from this episode. Assets no longer need to be deployed to be effective. Their value lies increasingly in their status within institutional systems rather than in their physical utility. That shift changes how competition unfolds. Instead of races to extract or transport, we see races to recognize, to legitimize, to lock in outcomes before alternatives gain traction. Once that happens, power expresses itself quietly, through compliance rather than enforcement. The public often interprets this as passivity. In reality, it is consolidation. This also explains why escalation was unnecessary. There was no need to challenge China directly because the framework left little room for response. The decision space had already been narrowed, and narrowing decision space is one of the most effective forms of control. What remains after such moments is not resolution, but adjustment. Other actors observe. They recalibrate assumptions, they update strategies to account for a system that behaves differently than before. This is how influence compounds over time, not through singular events, but through episodes that redefine what is possible and what is not. The significance of this moment lies not in the asset itself, but in the clarity it provided. It showed in concrete terms how modern power is exercised when speed, recognition, and structure align, and it left a final question hanging. How many other assets exist in similar limbo, waiting for the same kind of resolution? By the time the broader picture became visible, there was nothing left to contest, no announcement to dispute, no transfer to reverse, no dramatic gesture to respond to. The decisive moment had already passed. This is what makes this episode easy to misunderstand. From the outside, it may look like hesitation or restraint. In reality, it was resolution that occurred before reaction became possible. China did not fail because it lacked influence or intent. It missed the moment because the environment shifted faster than its preferred mode of engagement could adapt. Timing, in this case, did not reward patience. Once the framework hardened, the asset ceased to be an option. Not because it vanished, but because it no longer belonged to the realm of negotiation. It had been reclassified from leverage to artifact, and that transition happened without spectacle. This is how moments are missed in modern geopolitics. Not through visible defeat, but through closure, the point at which alternatives quietly disappear. What followed was not escalation, but recalibration. China adjusted posture, Venezuela absorbed the outcome, and the system incorporated the change as if it had always been there. These are the moments that reshape expectations. They remind actors that access is not guaranteed, that ambiguity can collapse quickly, and that recognition carries consequences long after attention moves elsewhere. The vaults themselves remain, the silver still exists, but its role has changed. What once represented flexibility became fixed. What once offered options became inert. And that shift tells us more about how power works today than any speech or declaration could.
This was not a story of force overwhelming resistance. It was a story of sequence, of arriving first at the point where decisions stop being debated and start being enforced automatically. Once that threshold is crossed, outcomes don't need to be defended. They simply persist. The larger implication is difficult to ignore. As global systems grow more fragmented and contested, these races will become more common. Not races to seize territory or resources in the traditional sense, but races to define status before alternatives emerge. Whoever moves first within accepted structures gains an advantage that does not look dramatic but proves durable. This episode did not end with confrontation. It ended with a recalibration of assumptions, and those recalibrations tend to matter long after the headlines fade. Because in a world governed by timing and recognition, the most important moments are often the ones that pass without notice, and once they do, they rarely return.